Yeah, so may the 4th be with you. This is a very special episode here on military aviation history because we're venturing into a galaxy far, far away for May the 4th. Because what we want to do is basically talk about the Empire and Star Wars in general, their fleet design, their military sort of structure, and come at this from a military historian's perspective. And joining me, of course, is Justin Pike of the Japanese series on the channel. How are you doing, Justin?
I'm doing pretty well, and you made the fatal error of suggesting you talk about Star Wars with me. So,
Yes, we are in for a long video here, I think. But I think it's actually quite an interesting subject to sort of take a very fictional realm and talk about sort of the more realistic or more rational elements in it and some of the weird things that happen as well. So as we get into this, I understand there's lots of Star Wars fans out there. Uh, Justin is one of them. I'm one of them. And we are going at this not necessarily from, there's going to be some criticism of some things here and there. So we have some caveats to make before we get into this, don't we, Justin?
yeah, so we're be kind of mix and matching elements from both Legends and canon, alongside with some extrapolations just based on our own analysis. So if you want really strict adherence to the lore, there's of course lots of great, lore Star Wars YouTube channels out there. Two of my personal favorites are Eckhart's Ladder and also the criminally undersubscribed Corey's Datapad. I really enjoy them. And basically, it's just because Star Wars lore and books and movies, they're widely contradictory. They lack consistent information on a lot of important elements. Um, Things like it's lacking detailed breakdown of force architecture and strengths and things
Oh,
like
yeah.
that. And then before people start typing about the essential guide to warfare, it has that for very specific things, and literally nobody else ever paid attention to it. So that's an example of the problems that you end up facing, because ultimately the real rule in Star Wars is rule of cool.
Yeah,
So we kind of have to make do. Um, so I'll just like a couple examples. Just tactical details for engagements are generally rare. And
super
then
rare. Yeah.
entire ship classes are missing basic details, like even things like entry to service dates and production numbers.
Yeah.
In short, Star Wars is not a military science fiction universe, even though you can do military science fiction in the universe, which is what we'll kind of be playing around with. So.
Yeah, and just to bounce off on that, as I was looking at some of the engagements that, of course, happen in the Star Wars movies, and if you take the Battle of Coruscant, then you have a host of different starships, and as you start looking at, okay, how are these armed, where are the weapons placed, and so on, you actually realize that there's very little information, and you sort of have to extrapolate from what you see on the screen where the weapons are placed and what there is there, to get a basic understanding of how these spaceships are supposed to be employed. And that doesn't even get us starting about how different the Battle of Coruscant already is to basically any other engagement that we see in the Star Wars universe. And yeah, there's many great designs as well, as you were saying. The Rule of Cool. I mean, the Tie Fighter is an absolute gorgeous design in my opinion. I also really like the Y wings. That was the first Lego kit that I ever had. Was actually a Y wing, and it like
We're peas in a pod, man. The Y
yeah.
wing and the tie.
Yeah, it's just they're beautiful. I never cared about the X-wing. I'm gonna be completely honest. What did it for me as well is the Naboo Starfighter. I had that in Lego as well. I think the first generation Naboo Starfighter that I ever published, um, and I still have it in the attic somewhere at my parents' place. I have to build that thing again and then just go on a wild ride of nostalgia. But yeah, talking about Starfighters, they really have an outsized role, it seems, in Star Wars because it goes with that rule of cool. It goes with the mythical hero, the space wizard, who can make things happen, either through skill or because they're wielding the Force. And that really creates problems now for us to talk about, the ship designs and the Force architecture, because everybody has that image of a single plane goes in and destroys an ISD, like an Imperial Star Destroyer. Isn't that's one of the main issues, isn't it?
Yeah, and really does just boil down to how do you make your hero awesome in your exciting adventure movie. Well, you have them swing a fleet engagement in a single seat starfighter,
Yeah.
which of course has very stark lore implications of like starfighters are extremely powerful,
Yeah.
um, like way more powerful than you would typically associate an aircraft in the Second World War to be. And we're not just pulling on the Second World War because that happens to be our wheelhouse. It's because the Second World War is very clearly a direct inspiration for how they tend to depict starfighter combat in Star Wars. Very famously, of course, they used, I can't remember the name of the movie that they pulled like almost shot for shot to create the Millennium Falcon escape sequence in The New Hope. Is it like 12 o'clock high? Or
it could be 12 o'clock high. But I mean, even the starship design is based on that. Like in one of the newer movies, you have that bombing run against the dreadnought, right?
Yeah.
Where it's clearly like meant to be sort of B-17s with the gunner positions and everything.
Yeah, and so the end result is, you have like 30 rebel starfighters. They blow up the Death Star. You have plenty of engagements in the Clone Wars are decided by small starfighter elements. We see in Rogue One just a tiny handful of Y-Wings sees a chance to slip through the tie screen, and it's just like single pass. They royally mess up a Star Destroyer. And I know in some Legends lore, I think it was the X-Wing series, if I remember right, Wedge mentions that starfighters don't have great odds of destroying an ISD, but it's really not sustained in other depictions that are out there. Again, lots of contradictions. That series, though, does have a really fun term of trench run disease, which was coined by the rebels for ships and stations that were really vulnerable to similar tactics that they used to destroy the Death Star. In short, really flying really close to the surface of the vessel so it couldn't sufficiently defend itself without starfighter cover. Always thought that was fun. But yeah, so there's historical parallels that we can pull upon. Like some people will point out, like some of the carrier battles in the Pacific, where a relatively small number of aircraft devastate like a fleet. I guess you could counter that with, well, there were still hundreds of aircraft participating, even in something like the Battle of Midway, to make that handful of aircraft get through to their targets. But yeah, I mean, I guess if you want to add a little bit more here, where it's more of a filmic thing than a realistic thing.
I mean, it's that hero trope, right? It's like somebody has to go in, and the rebels, of course, as the rebels, they have to succeed where nobody else could have succeeded, and blow up the Death Star. But what always struck me with the Death Star, even back in the day when I was still a bit younger, is like, why? How was this possible, right? And then as I grew up and read a little bit more about military history and like how air defense sort of sectors work and how you structure your air defense around certain targets. Of course, the Death Star is going to have point defense, right? Just around it with hundreds of turrets and so on, but they don't really seem to be all that effective. And there is, I think, a scene in A New Hope where they say like, oh yeah, the fighters are too fast for our turbo lasers. As like
one of the most consistent lore things ever.
Yes, but it's like, you know that. You have TIE fighters yourself. Surely you practice a little bit of like, how could this happen? Like, how do point defenses interact with fighters and vice versa? So surely, like, the Empire would know that. And also coming from the Clone Wars, of course, where there's also a lot of fighters, that is still the ship design, and anything that comes with that is still rooted very much in sort of the ship design of the Republic Army with the clone ships. So I never really quite understood why they were so ineffective, and they had these sort of slow-moving, slow-firing turbo lasers as doing point defense. But more importantly, something like the Death Star, you'd think that they had screens upon screens of TIE fighters that work in these sort of, it would have to be three-dimensional, of course, defense blocks where there's a squadron or a flight here, a flight there, and they sort of interact with rebels coming in their own air defense box. And then as the rebels move from one box to the next towards the target, which is the Death Star, you wouldn't expect them to be anywhere close to surviving any of this. Now, you can point out, of course, maybe the Empire was a bit too confident, that they didn't really understand the dangers of a single starfighter or a host of starfighters, but it just seems very, very weird, and it's something that comes up time and time again, as we were saying, because of that rule of cool. And Poe Dameron's actions in one of the new more recent ones. I mean, there's two really. There's that one where then I think Finn yells, "That's one hell of a pilot." I mean, it's a cool scene where Poe comes in and shoots down like 7 or 9
something like that. Yeah.
First Order starfighters in one sort of sweeping shot. Looks cool, but it just it doesn't work that way. And we probably should also move on for this, because we could argue about this in circles. But the lack of point defense and sort of the inability to scramble interceptors in time, as well as work with them in sort of these layered defenses, is always something that stood out for me. But maybe as we then talk about the Empire, we should maybe swing back first towards the Clone Wars and talk about that, because that's where the core of the Empire's officer corps was also molded, wasn't it?
Yeah, so we can talk a bit about the last war.
Yes.
Like so many Second World War historians will talk about in reference to the First World War. The Clone Wars is the last war in this chunk of the Star Wars universe.
Yeah.
So both sides in that war generally lacked starfighters with hyperdrives, which I think is a really key issue. Certainly at scale. So I know, like technically the Republic did have some limited capability for starfighters to act independent of a carrier with the use of hyperspace rings, but they never seem to use these at scale, and I can kind of see why, because hyperspace rings themselves are kind of cumbersome and vulnerable to destruction. Like once you get to your destination, you detach from it, it's just sitting there. Yeah. And if the enemy shoots it, then you're stuck there. So it doesn't have really strong military utility. And what this really meant is that fights tended to devolve into slugging matches between carriers, basically, and their escorts. And there was kind of two different philosophies for between the CIS and Republic.
So I mean, this is actually interesting, because they're creating a ship that doesn't really exist, like in our real space in reality for us. So I mean, the CIS is very heavily reliant on sort of this light carrier design, right?
Yeah, so the light carriers, like, because they use a lot of parasite fighters,
yes,
which is cool. And so they have like Maleficent class frigates and Recusant class destroyers, where they don't really have much. If I can't even remember if they have hangars at all. They might have small ones, but for the most part, like they basically, their fighters just cling to the outside hull, and then once they come out of hyperspace, they just jump off because they're autonomous.
Which you can do because they're uncrewed, right?
Yeah, it's really clever.
Yeah.
And then they do have larger ships, so like the Lucre Hulk converted freighter that has a sizable starfighter component, and also the Providence class is kind of their battle carrier equivalent to the Venator.
Yeah.
But they're relatively rare. Like you usually only see them as like maybe a single flagship for a whole fleet, as opposed to the Republic, which really leans into this battle carrier concept with the Venator, where you see the bulk of their fleet is the Venator, and then they'll maybe have some supporting ships around it. Now, the Venator itself, it was modestly armed cruiser for its size, but it had lots and lots of hangar spaces. You see time and time again you see it in Revenge of the Sith. You also see it over and over again in the Clone Wars animated series. Just tons of hangar space. It's practically just a big carrier. But it does have still considerable offensive and defensive capability as well. Now, this battle carrier concept isn't an official Star Wars lore term, so I think we have to kind of explain it a bit. And because there's basically this class of ship in Star Wars that combines sizable starfighter carrying capacity with significant defensive and offensive weapon suites and heavy protection. And historically speaking, it's effectively a combination of a battleship and a carrier. There isn't a neat historical parallel to this outside perhaps the very questionable Issei-class battleship carrier conversions during the Second World War. But some in-universe examples, they include like the MC-80A for the Rebels, the Imperial-class Star Destroyer for the Empire, the Providence-class for the CIS, and the Venator for the Galactic Republic. So starfighters were often vitally important in the Clone Wars, often proving decisive, but destruction of the opponent's carriers would also carry the day more often than not. And you kind of see like this, the tactics they adopt are a little odd, which I guess you could get into a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, maybe staying just with the ships a little bit more, because as you were mentioning with the parasite fighters, I mean, we do have to think about like sort of what are these ships transporting and what are they meant to do at the target, and what is their sort of sustainment as well, because with the Republic going with this battle carrier sort of concept, they're transporting a lot of troops and they're transporting a lot of starfighters as strike packages, in order to have basically each sort of task force being able to go somewhere with humans and sustaining these humans, which any sort of, this is actually an interesting point, like how much of the CIS ships was actually had life support, right? There were probably
Yeah.
some core areas that had life support for the humanoid, or any sort of, I think there was like an arachnid sort of general as well, wasn't there?
Oh yeah, the giant
Somewhere
spider
somewhere
guy.
in the
Trench, Admiral
Clone
Trench.
Wars, yes. That of course needs life support, whereas that is something that you only need like a small concentrated core of the ship, and otherwise you just fill it up with droids, right? Whereas on the Venator or any sort of thing that the Republic builds, it has to be a lot more self-sustaining. And as you're going from system to system, trying to defeat CIS incursions, or sort of get certain planets to be compliant with the Republic, you need to present sort of that sustainment effort in order to sustain those operations. The CIS doesn't have that, and that's a big boon probably for them, for being able to go also for this more light carrier design, building a lots of ships, being everywhere at once, and presenting challenges here and there. Almost, I mean, the CIS. It's never really fully explained whether they have a doctrine that is somewhat akin to the rebels, in that they hit and run and they pick their battles. Is that something that is established in the lore, that they want to be
They
more
seem
flexible where they act?
they seem to be so there's like some specific examples, like of course the attack against Coruscant, where they find a particular hyperspace lane. So I guess for people who aren't familiar, like you can't just jump from one place to another in Star Wars just randomly. You have to
Yeah.
use these lanes, and they end up discovering a new hyperspace route that would allow them to basically backdoor into Coruscant, which is how you get to that battle at the beginning of Revenge of the Sith, is they've dropped directly into the Republic's capital using this backdoor. But they tended to still favor like lots of set piece engagements. They don't necessarily hit and
Mm.
run a lot. They like blockades. So there's a lot of
Yeah.
episodes of the Clone Wars that are about them blockading a planet and the Republic needs to get through for whatever reason. Um, but it tends to be fights between sizable fleets generally. Um, and I think you do raise a good point there about like some of the sustainment problems that the Republic would have versus the CIS. Like I know, for example, with the Recusant class destroyer, canonically, it actually has a droid brain. So like the ship itself is not crewed traditionally. The ship is a droid
Mm.
effectively. It's just not very smart
Yeah.
in lore. But yeah, that's kind of a neat concept. It's why it's like it looks so skeletal. Actually, I really like the Recusant class destroyer. It's probably one of my favorite ship
Yeah.
designs. Um, but yeah, you see like in the movies and in throughout the Clone Wars series, these slugging matches. Like they're almost, I mean, you see ships literally broadsiding each other at
Yeah, it's Battle of
point blank
Trafalgar in
range.
space, right?
Yeah,
That's what it
yeah.
is. Yeah.
And again, it's a rule of cool thing.
Yeah.
But you can see how like the certain lessons that you can pull out of this war, if we treat it seriously,
Yeah.
why the Empire makes some of the design decisions they do with their own fleet later on.
Yeah, I'm wondering, because one of the things that, if you grow up with episode 4 to 6, you always see these ships at standoff range, right, lobbing shots after shots at each other. That is expanded a little bit more in episode 7 to 9 as well, but in the Clone Wars, there's way less of that. And as you were saying with the Battle of Coruscant, it's incredibly close quarter. And if you look at the sort of the placement of the guns, knowing of course that we can move in a three-dimensional space, and that would probably not matter as much, but a lot of the guns seem to be placed on the sides of the ships, or on the upper side facing outwards with sort of this 90-degree arc, whereas then later on the weapons are employed in a frontal arc, even though the placement is more or less similar.
Yeah, weapon placement in Star Wars is very interesting because, of course, like out of universe, there's particularly for the older Star Wars movies, the models just weren't detailed enough to have like individual weapon placements, other than the turrets that were like abaft the superstructure
Yeah.
on the Imperial Star Destroyer. But for the most part, like the lasers are just kind of coming out of the ships, and really a lot of lore is like trying to figure out where they are. Some of the newer ship models, like some of the stuff for the CIS, you can actually see at least the larger forward mounted weapons systems. And then in the Clone Wars series, you can see all the turrets mounted under the Beneficent frigate superstructure and all of that. But there's still at least some ambiguity, particularly for the Venator, like where stuff is coming. Like it seems to just come out of the trench. I think Eckhart's Ladder calls it like the Oreo cookie center on like the side of ships in Star Wars, where the lasers come out. Yeah, and it's kind of interesting how they make these design decisions because, of course, again, it just comes down to ultimately a rule of cool thing. But at least like the wedge shape of a Star Destroyer means that you can, presumably, if you have a lot of these weapons mounts in your little trench, they can fire forward. And since you're a wedge shape, it means more of your firepower can be directed ahead,
Yeah.
which is kind of neat. More
And
explanation for that.
I mean, you show less of a target as well at that point.
Mm-hmm.
And you can just concentrate your shielding in the frontal section as well, and it makes perfect sense. But as then the clones win the war for the Republic, and the Republic becomes the Empire, now the ISD appears. Obviously, some of those clone ships are being used for a while as well, but they're more and more relegated to sort of auxiliary roles. And then as the ISD appears, I think it's one of those ship designs that does get a lot of criticism every now and then, but I don't necessarily agree with it. Because if you consider that the Empire initially, of course, has to make sure that what was the Republic is now compliant with this sort of new order, not being the actual new order that we then see later on, but with following Emperor Palpatine's directions, shall we say, then having a very sort of flexible fleet-based strike force in each sector that makes either short work of pirates or local rebellions, or it can strong arm planetary governors into compliance, is quite reasonable. And the Empire becomes initially this force of compliance and policing that builds up this fleet that can, where each ISD can basically operate autonomously and fulfill exactly those roles.
Yeah, like I'm also kind of an apologist for the ISD. It comes in for a lot of hate sometimes, and I think because there tends to be an assumption that it's basically the battleship to the Venator's carrier, and I think there's some truth to it, except that really they're both fundamentally the same type of battle carrier. It's just that the ISD leans a little bit more into the battle part. I think like if I remember the fighter complements, I think there's only like it's like 70 something ties versus 90 something depending on what you're carrying in the Venator. So it's actually not a massive drop in starfighter carrying capacity, but of course the ISD is a way more capable battleship effectively. So really the ISD, a lot of its gain and capability is just coming from the fact that it's way bigger than a Venator. So it's just they made it bigger and it could do more. So I'm not quite as firm on that whole like, oh, they should have stayed with the Venator because it's a carrier. It's like, well, the ISD is a carrier too, effectively. And I can kind of see why they would lean into the battleship side of the equation a little bit more, because again, when you look back to the Clone Wars, where so many battles are decided by the destruction of the enemy's carriers and their escorts, and then if they are destroyed, the fighters don't have hyperspace capabilities, so it's like they're just stuck there. Like they're operationally, strategically, they're done, even if they survive the battle once the carriers have been neutralized. So in this context, a battle carrier that could reliably knock out an opponent's counterpart and take hits in return and stay operational, you can really see the desirable qualities in that in universe.
Plus, I mean, the historic parallel here to the real world would be that you basically build an army or fleet for the last war, right? And that also, what is it, the Detector class ISD, right? That actually doesn't have any starfighters inside of it. I mean, that is one that in retrospect is a little bit harder to defend. But if you look at it from a perspective of, the Empire wants to make sure that there are certain ships that have more firepower that are then protected by another ISD fighter and then the strike component, and working in conjunction with that in fleet engagements, then something like the Detector class that has more firepower makes sense.
Yeah, and like and to the credit of the lore, the Tector was never popular in Imperial Navy service. So I'm like, okay, I don't know if they ever explain exactly why, but I assume it would have to be because it doesn't have a starfighter complement. And I'm like, well,
Yeah.
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 Like, I think there was only one Tector present at Endor, the one you see. For those who don't know, there is technically a Tector on screen for like 1 second in Return of the Jedi.
You'll see it
Because
when you do the thing that Justin does and goes screen by, like, frame
I have
by
to actually
frame.
find that screen for it. It's very silly because it would technically have to be flying upside down versus the rest of the formation, but it's clearly the bottom of an ISD model, but it doesn't have a hangar. So
Okay.
they're like, well, it's clearly a new ship class because that's the way it works. But
I wonder if they made just multiple designs of the ISD, like, to film, and then they
yeah, I
realized
can't
we
see
need
it
one more to
intentionally.
fill up the scene, and this little thing that we're never going to use, we just put it in there, and then like lore just appeared for it.
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
perfect.
Oh yeah.
And then yeah, like you make a very good point with the kind of the political strategic aspect of the ISD. Is it's big and scary, and you can cow systems
Yeah.
just with an ISD showing up because it's big and intimidating.
Yeah.
And of course, there is the Tarkin doctrine generally of ruling through fear. I won't get into it because that's a whole other 16-hour video we could talk about. Where I generally hate super weapons as a
Oh
concept,
yeah.
but the Death Star always worked for me because it's couched so much in the universe and like why a political entity like the Empire would build something like that and think that it's like sound. I always
It's
like
not
that, which
without
I
criticism either, right? I mean, we
yeah, like
see
the even in the movie.
very,
Yeah.
yeah, it's a New Hope, no, where they have that discussion, and Darth Vader almost chokes somebody, where they have a discussion about the value. They never fully get into it to the point where I would have liked them to have that discussion. But one of the people, the one person that was speaking up, not against Darth
Cassio
Vader,
Tog.
yes, he, after at least in the comics, I believe it was, after the New Hope and the Battle of Yavin, he was, I think, promoted to build a new fleet, and that was following his sort of perception how things should be, of a very flexible force that is centered around the ISD, where the ISD goes from planet X to planet Y, policing and hunting down the rebels. And arguably, if we look at the reaction of the Empire against the rebellion post Battle of Yavin, I mean, they had them on the run. And like the Battle of Hoth really is like a big, massive moment against the rebellion, where it's actually surprising that even though they managed to evacuate, that they were able to recover from that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's lots of interesting back and forth there with I love that Death Star conference scene. I've loved it since I was a kid.
Mm.
And that's why I love Andor so much, because Andor is basically the Death Star conference scene, except the Space Wizard never
Yeah.
interrupts it. And yeah, like it's just interesting seeing how ISDs are used tactically. You don't see it; they don't see them in action as much as you'd probably like.
Mm.
But they do tend to, and I notice you observe this as well. They tend to hang back,
Yeah.
and then the fighters go out and do things.
Yeah.
And then the ISDs are kind of sitting back and chipping away with their own firepower. And I guess you have a theory that it's like maybe this is like an echo of certain doctrine where it's just like, hey, we don't want, these things are expensive, and we're kind of just into colonial policing,
Yeah.
basically. We'll let the ties sort it out, and we'll sit back here and chip away. And I guess like the Battle of Scarif is a great example of that, with Admiral Gorin. Seemed to deploy his two ISDs very conservatively.
Oh yes.
And I'm definitely going to put his picture up of him going as the other ISD is about to kill him. Yeah, the where he's hanging back, like, and you can even see some shots where they're using a fraction of the firepower on the ISDs. Like
Oh yeah.
they're firing from like their very forward most mounts, and everything else is sitting idle, and he's just chipping away and letting the fighters handle it. And my headcanon was always like, this is a guy that's close to retirement, and he's settled in. He's been tasked with defending an archive that has a planetary shield. You're like, what's going to happen, right? Like somebody's going to come back with their overdue library book. Like it's it's not an
Plus,
issue.
there's like a full battalion or whatever, is being sent out to hunt down the rebels that have landed, right? And he doesn't really
Yeah.
know what's happening on the ground either, because I'm not sure if do Imperial comms work. I
Yeah,
presumably
I
they
wonder if
do.
they would. Like maybe they would
Mm.
have some kind of override, but it's entirely
Yeah,
possible maybe they've also been cut off
yeah,
communications wise from what's going on the surface. And then yeah, he's just sitting back chilling. And it's like, it's basically somebody who probably wasn't cut out for a full fleet engagement anymore. And then he had one thrust into his lap and he was just not the man for the moment.
yeah.
And then he ends up kind of paying the price of that. So,
Well,
and then,
the other thing is, and this goes with maybe with the rule of cool. This is my little conspiracy theory that now comes up, is the film producers. And by the way, I love Rogue One. Yeah, I think it's one of the best Star Wars movies out there. Um, but the film producers were like, there's going to be an ISD, and the Rebel fleet is not supposed to be overwhelming. There's supposed to be a sort of a support fleet that gets the X-wings where they and the landing craft. Was it the V-wings, or what are those landing craft called? The ones with
oh my
the
goodness.
changing wings.
Yeah. I'm trying to remember what it's actually called. We're
Um,
terrible fans.
we're horrible. We've just discredited ourselves completely. I
Yeah.
don't know what some obscure landing ship is called. Yeah, but to just get them there, and there's going to be an ISD, and how can we make sure that this ISD is going to go down? How can we make sure that the shield is destroyed? Ah, says somebody in the back row. Says add a second ISD, have Y-Wings disabled it, and then call up a Hammerhead Corvette that appears out of nowhere. How did it get there, by the way? How did it get into the position to push that ISD into Admiral Gorkin's ISD? Like, how did that work? I mean, I love that movie, but I'm just gonna, I'm not gonna dwell on
Yeah.
it.
Yeah.
But it is, yeah, it is weird, because I always felt it peculiar that Admiral Gorkin wouldn't go into it full guns blazing.
Hmm.
And basically, I mean, you make a good argument of saying, maybe he's a late career officer. He's like, okay, what are a couple of rebels going to do? Um, but equally, you could say, well, this guy had a last shot at glory, and he could have just taken it. And if he had pushed up with his ISDs, I don't think the rebels could have done much, to be honest.
No, and I mean you
Yeah,
see the impact of it. Like when
yeah.
Vader shows up in Devastator at the end of it, he uses his ISD.
As a,
He rips the fleet, what's left of it, to pieces
yeah.
in very short order. Uh,
Yeah,
so
it's peculiar, and it's. I mean, the idea that I always had, and that you were mentioning as well, because we had discussions about this as well. That generally the doctrine was perhaps use your fighters and TIE bombers and so on to weaken up the target, and as it is weakening up, you move in with your ISD and you destroy it. That prevents the ISD from being damaged. Then you don't have to do repairs. You don't have to go back to the Kuwait.
drive
What are they
yards,
called? This, yeah.
KDY.
Um, and have it repaired, and it stays on station in the area. It's easier to replace ties than it is an ISD, right? But in this case, it just appears weird, and I just don't recognize any sort of doctrine or strategy in it beyond incompetence.
Yeah.
It's yeah, but that happens. Battles are sometimes won because one side was
Yeah.
incompetent or badly prepared or made some bad calls, and we shouldn't be too harsh about that either.
Yeah.
But it does
For
bring up once again sort of the weakness that we also see in the ISD with sort of limited point defenses as well, don't we?
Yeah, and that's something that I think is pretty much the greatest weakness of the ISD, in my opinion, is this shortage of point defense weapons. So there's variance between canon and legends. So in legends, it does have, at least the ISD-1 has some point defense, like it says 40 mounts, whatever that means. Apparently, like I looked at the MC-80 in legends, and it's 80 mounts, so I guess half the number of an MC-80. But in canon, the point defense mounts basically disappear. I think they have like two,
Yeah.
one stern and one at the very bow. So it's virtually nothing. And I think the cannon armament meshes better with the on-screen evidence that we have, where the IST is really bad at hitting
Yeah.
small ship targets. Like it's clearly loaded up with larger turbo lasers that are intended for ship to ship. And this limited point defense, it places an excessive reliance on the ISD's starfighter complement to keep
Mm.
starfighters away from it, with a little backstop to help with leakers, as the US Navy would call them in the Second World War context, where maybe Japanese aircraft would get through the combat air patrol, and then the AA has to deal with them.
Yeah.
And this, it's kind of a strange thing when you look back on the Clone Wars, and like they're still using a lot of starfighters on both sides, and it's kind of weird that it disappears from the ISD mostly.
Well, the one thing I would say is that maybe because you have less pitched battles and the only thing you're hunting down are sort of pirates, or you're strong arming governors with a little bombardment and flyby of your ties, right? That maybe they felt they didn't need that anymore. But it is consistent in the lore that as even the rebellion is gaining strength and they're gaining capital ships and so on, and gaining more and more fighters, that really there is no point defense being added. And also, where are the missiles? Why are there no more? Why are there no missiles? Right?
Because they're not cool.
I mean, you can make them cool, like the Battle of Coruscant, right?
Can.
They have really smart missiles that are almost a bit too smart as they're following.
Oh yeah,
maybe you can make an argument that these were very specialized missiles, even though like a random vulture droid shot them off. But maybe he had programming only to target specific Jedi ships, right? Because those starfighters that Luke and Obi-Wan used were Jedi for the Jedi's only, right? But I'm getting too much into the weeds of it here.
Yeah,
but the other thing
frequently.
But the other thing is like, okay, so we know the Empire doesn't just have ISDs; they also have smaller ships. And why are they not part of the Force and add point defense or more like close-in firepower in order to provide a second layer for Y-wings or X-wings to punch through before they actually get to the ISDs, right? A little bit like you play Empire at War.
Yeah, and it's interesting. So one thing I'll hit, because I know, well, maybe we won't get comments, but I'll make sure we cover our asses here. Is that in canon the ISD seems to only appear post-war, but in Legends it actually saw service in the Clone Wars at the very end as the Imperator class. So I guess it raises a lot of interesting questions. That makes the ISD's design probably less competent in Legends than it does in canon, because in canon you can have that political angle influencing it, you can have like the lower intensity engagements influencing it, but then in the Clone Wars it's like, oh no, it's already here, like they designed it for the Clone Wars and it has no point defense on it. It's like but anyway, and yeah, like the lack of fleet escorts generally, which again, I know before people start typing comments, we know that in lore there are so many different escort ship classes. Even in the Star Wars Rebels series, which probably is for on-screen depictions of the Imperial fleet, it's by far the most varied. You see like Architens, like cruisers, you see Gazantes, you see Quasar Fire, etc., etc. But generally speaking, in the movies, I mean, it's just ISDs, and they're largely unescorted. In written lore, you've got stuff like the Lancer class in Legends, which was actually that's worth discussing on its own, just because that was specifically a anti-starfighter point defense escort that was developed in Legends after the Death Star blew up. And they're like, wait, maybe we need to take the starfighter threat more seriously. But then you never see it really. So really the Legends excuse is that it was like kind of expensive for its size and it was slow, and they just never really had that many of them in the fleet to basically excuse why they don't show up much. But it's I guess it opens up a discussion of like dedicated anti-aircraft warships, which do exist. So even in the Second World War, they exist, although they're relatively uncommon. Like every nation maybe has like one. And then they find that like really the best way to do AA defenses is like, okay, sure, you can have those kinds of ships, but you need to put AA on like everything. So because like the AA ship is not going to be everywhere in the fleet, they can't target every incoming threat. You put AA guns where they'll fit on all sorts of different ships.
Oh yeah, I mean, look at any sort of allied, like United States Navy or Royal Navy ships during the Second World War. They start off with very light AA complements, sometimes just 50 cal, sometimes just like a couple of pom-poms, and then eventually guns everywhere. Like honestly, guns everywhere. I think some time ago I made a video about HMS Belfast, and if you go through the armament, and then I show it on the actual ship as I was able to visit it here in London. Um, the amount of guns on this thing compared to what it had at the start, and in what quick succession, and also how this ship was specifically retrofitted then to go into the Pacific. Um, it arrived too late, but to go there and be ready for Japanese kamikaze, it just shows you how very much adaptive ships can be. And I don't think this would be different in a fictional realm of Star Wars, in being outfitted for specific roles in quick succession. Also keeping in mind that I think the Empire has like, what was it, 25,000 ISDs? Surely they had a couple of them in reserve they could have just like outfitted and like sent in after the rebels. I'm sorry, but who's in charge of point defense? Show me that admiral. Show me that admiral.
Particularly since the Imperial 2, so that I guess for people who aren't like weirdos like us, there are subclasses of Star Destroyer on that appear on screen. So the Star Destroyers you see in A New Hope, the original Star Wars movie, are Imperial 1 class, and you see them in Rogue One as well. And then in Empire Strikes Back, they changed the model a little bit, and that became a subclass of Star Destroyer, the Imperial 2, which doubled down on the anti-ship firepower and sacrificed even more of the utility from the Imperial 1. So in other words, it's like they recognize the starfighter threat, but they're tripling down on making themselves more vulnerable to starfighters, which is very counterintuitive. It's hard to explain because historically, like, that's not how military organizations respond to problems like that.
I mean, as you mentioned earlier, there are a lot of different classes that have never been really formally expanded upon on the screen, right? They are in comics, they are in books, they are in some video games as well, and a lot of this is probably just creative sort of license of being able. Okay, we need something. We are going to add some boutique ship designs that I just came up with because I thought it was cool, or because it maybe has a real purpose as well. But one of the things that always struck me, because we've been hammering the Empire a little bit here, is that they do one thing really well, even if they do it poorly in some ways, and that is standardization, right? They really hone in on economies of scale and like constant standardization. You see this from the tactical and technological level to sort of the strategic level of how they employ their fleet and how they build it up and construct that force. Han Solo, for example, was flunked out of the pilot academy because he wasn't following standard procedures. Now that is something that would basically happen in any Air Force, really. People would have a more stern talk with you for a couple of times, and if you then keep on doing, just sort of maverick things, then you will get flunked out, right? But that gives you one example in an otherwise somewhat lukewarm movie where it shows there is a real standardization that they're going for, not just sort of on the technical level, but also the tactics that are employed and the personnel that they are developing. And then in canon, we do know that they have more specialized squadrons as well that you get to as you have a track record of, as we would say nowadays, being combat ready, mission capable, and so on and so forth, as a pilot, which is really interesting. And I think that's one of those things where we peek behind the curtain of what is otherwise not seen, and have a little bit of a look. And I just wish they would have shown more of that in Han Solo, which is two things I like to see more in Han Solo movie. That is one of them, and the second one was the normal Imperial army, not the stormtroopers. The run-of-the-mill trooper of the Imperial army who was not a stormtrooper. Those were the elite. And please, can we see more of them? Because then it also makes sense that they miss.
That's another reason why I love Andor so much, is we got to have way more Imperial army. And I mean, even in season 2, it's not really a spoiler, it's in the trailers and stuff. Like, you can see the uniforms, but they show up. And it's nice to see them. Because I think so much lore and everything like that, they just want to see stormtroopers. It's like, stormtroopers are the soldiers of the Empire. It's like, well, technically they're the elite, and the reason why you see them in the original trilogy is because that tiny slice of the Empire we ever see in that is basically the elite. It's like in the first time, it's like the the stormtrooper complement aboard Vader's flagship and the fleet chasing the rebels, and then in Empire Strikes Back, it's Death Squadron, the fleet tasked with chasing the rebels around. Yeah. And then in Return of the Jedi, it's the 501st Legion getting embarrassed by teddy bears. That's why you see stormtroopers and some Navy troopers, to be fair, in the original trilogy. But anyway, it's the way the Empire standardizes is something that I feel is a little underappreciated. Like, I agree with you there, because really, like, this gets into the scale of like science fiction, space fantasy, whatever universes like Star Wars, where it's like almost incomprehensible to us, like the amount of bureaucracy and things, the force levels you would need to actually run an empire that controls about maybe 2/3 of a galaxy, because there's of course the unknown regions and stuff that they're not really too involved in, but it's incomprehensible to us. So it's like, you're gonna have to like standardize on some stuff. And I am willing to accept at least some redundancy and bloat in ship designs, because this is also an autocracy that has basically unlimited military budgets, and you're going to have all of these different companies doing, milking the system.
Oh yeah, there's corruption rampant in the Empire. We know this.
Oh yeah. And then Legends, even factoring that in, Legends definitely pushes it too far, where it's like every time there's a comic, there's a new ship class that you never see again. Yeah. And you're like, it's always, I'm a sucker for the Gazanti. I love that little ship, even though it's like a dumpy little transport. We saw it again in Andor season 2 in the first arc, just briefly. I'm like, it's a Gazanti.
There it is. And just to your point earlier with the Tarkin doctrine and fear, right? We see on screen that just that single Gazanti, and everybody's like, oh no, the Empire is here, right? Just random workers are completely struck with fear as that appears. And that gives credence to that doctrine in many ways.
Yeah, and that's another thing. I mean, I'm trying not to, so I actually, I have a shrine to Andor back there. I could gush about it for hours and hours on end.
We'll zoom in on it. Slowly as we talk, we'll have
I will include a picture. And it's just because it does so well, like handles how scary the Empire is. Yeah. Whereas often in a lot of Star Wars media, and sometimes it works because like the tone is different, right? Like a show, like a cartoon show aimed at children, like the Empire doesn't need to be like this horribly oppressive, like fascist nightmare. Like it
does, Justin. Yes, it does. That's what it is.
I mean, it'd be great for me. But
do you know, like the fairy tales that I had to listen to when I was growing up in Germany? This is no different. Yeah. This is no.
Yeah, I just want Rebel. We need that. Rebels ends in 6 episodes with the entire central cast just being summarily executed with stormtroopers
for being naughty children. There we go. That's why. No, but like talking about Andor, I mean that's a perfect segue then to the Rebel Alliance, right? Because they build up a fleet that is. First of all, it doesn't start out as a fleet, but like they're starting to build up a fleet, and we see some of that in some of the newer production as well. That then eventually goes on to challenge the Empire in quite big pitch battles, right? But they have some. It's while we were earlier on hammering about the single starfighter that does incredible things against an ISD or a Death Star. Their starfighter design is really, really interesting, isn't it?
Yeah, and obviously there's a lot of attention paid to the use of different starfighters in the Rebel Alliance. Of course, the Y-Wing wasn't specifically developed for them. It was one of the favorite aspects of the Y-Wing is that it's like basically dumpy leftovers from the Clone Wars, because I guess for people who don't know, the Y-Wing was like the standard bomber of the Galactic Republic during the Clone Wars, and ultimately what you see for the Rebels, where it looks like a stripped down piece of crap, is because it's basically what it is. They've stripped like a lot of the fuselage stuff out of it and everything. It's fun.
And they never used the defensive turret, which annoys me, but go on.
Oh yeah. Like, do they remove it in the Rebel version of it? I think they may have.
It may have, but like in some games at least, you can use it facing forward, right? But
Yep.
you'd imagine that like an asteroid or something could take
Yeah,
over
it could
even like
take over.
rudimentary defense duties.
Yeah. Yeah. Again, for
Yeah,
people who aren't as silly as us, the Y wing, the Republic version of it, actually has like a waist gunner.
yeah,
Um, yeah, which is kind of neat. Um, but yeah, so that, and of course, like people talk about the technological superiority of things like the X-wing over the TIE, which I think is overstated, um, because just based on on-screen evidence, like you can see TIEs are dishing it out against X-wings, like you, by implication in A New Hope, so the original Star Wars, when they attack the Death Star with 30 starfighters of mixed types, it's like what, three come back? There's Wedge, there's Luke, and there's like one Y-wing. I think
yeah.
I'm sure that
And
person has a
Han
name,
Solo,
but
but yeah,
and Han Solo, yeah.
yeah, who just
Um,
shows up and like nobody intercepted him.
it's fine.
Like if
Everyone on the long range scanners, they're just out. They're microwaving Pop Tarts or something.
it's just where like is Millennium Falcon, is that a stealth fighter now? Is that confirmed? It's like his shape, yeah. It's like a flounder. It bounces off, diffuses radar waves, whatever. Okay, he's a smuggler. You can make some sort of argument there, but no.
And there are some ridiculous numbers out there for like the success of the X-wing over the TIE. So one
Right.
example, just thrown into the Essential Guide to Warfare, mentions like a staggering like 71.5 to 1 kill ratio, which I actually burst out laughing when I saw that because I'm like, bullshit. Like, that is a level of overclaiming that is insane. And there's like those rebels are, I don't know if they're intentionally inflating their numbers or what's going on there, but um, it's clearly not that that dominant over the
Yeah,
TIE fighter. And I'm willing to concede that it's a better fighter than the TIE fighter. I think that's pretty clear. But the
it's got
TIE can
shielding,
dish it out.
right?
It's got shielding,
It's got more
which is
firepower.
worth, that's worth mentioning
Yeah.
actually as well, because and I got to give full credit to Eckhart's Ladder, because this is a video that he did a few years ago where he looked at on-screen depictions of shielding in starfighters, to
Mm-hmm.
see judge how effective it was, and basically he concluded that it was not as effective as you'd think, based on particularly stuff like video games where like shielded fighters can just get hammered on, where
Right.
the unshielded ones just blow up. It's like in the movies, like you see regularly X-wings, they go down in like one or two bursts, like they just, so it's, I guess it's almost more akin to like armor, in Second World War aircraft, which you just did a wonderful video on,
Yeah.
um, where it's kind of a saving throw, as you always say, instead of like something that you could just sit there and they just unload into you,
Yeah.
and the shields just take all of it. Like larger ships, that seems to be a little bit more the case. Like the Millennium Falcon seems to be able to actually take a
Yeah.
decent number of hits and not blow up. But those smaller ships, the shielding seems to be a little bit more like, it'll save you from getting hit maybe once or twice, but that's about it.
And I think the
Um,
ineffectiveness also shows by the fact that the normal standard run of the mill TIE fighter doesn't have any shielding. And
mm,
you can say that, okay, that makes the X-Wing better. But sure, maybe on a one off basis it does. But usually there are more TIE fighters. And it's not just about the quantity, but it makes the TIE fighter, arguably from a maintenance perspective and from a power distribution and how you have to set up your fighter and the shielding around it, a lot easier to produce and to maintain in the fleet. And that again gives credence to the fact that the ISDs, where these TIE fighters are on, have to often run autonomously, most likely, for a duration where they may be cut off from maintenance lines and logistic lines, and you don't necessarily want to be waiting for spare parts all the time. Although the contrapoint to that is, how can a rebel alliance that is a ragtag band of misfits somehow maintain this so much like technologically more advanced, it's like in it's not that much more advanced, but this more complex machine. um Although counter argument to that is, again, they have to, because they have to put quality over quantity.
yeah, and it's also worth noting that like another I, in my opinion, the biggest advantage that the Rebel starfighters have over the Empire is hyperdrives.
Yes.
So it's operational and strategic mobility. It's not so much tactical. Sure, they have maybe some edge tactical. I'll concede that, but like it's the fact that they can just drop out of hyperspace in a given area where the Empire is weak, blow a bunch of stuff up, and leave. And you actually see a perfect example of that in Rogue One, the movie, where they launch a strike against the base on Edu, and that's literally it. They go in, jump into hyperspace, hit this base before the base even fully realizes what's going on, and they're gone.
Yeah.
Um, and that kind of attack was something that the Empire really struggled to fight against, because you can see that influence of the Clone Wars, where it's like, our ties, they don't need hyperdrives. I'm sure that saved them a lot of money, looking at economies of scale and things
Oh,
like
yeah.
that. They're like, why bother with hyperdrives on TIE fighters when we've got carriers? We've got 25,000 ISDs at the height of the Empire. We've got quasar fires, we've got Gazantes. Like, we can get them through hyperspace via these other means. Why bother with having them, capable of it on their own? And I mean, the problem that they end up arising is that, like, you don't have a carrier everywhere that a rebel strike could hit. So according to one estimate in the Essential Guide to Warfare, which is Legends, not canon, the Rebel Alliance's space-going forces were about 7% of the Imperial Navy's strength at the height of this galactic civil war, which I feel tracks reasonably well.
Yeah.
However, as the guide notes, like, this force was able to have disproportionate impact because they were rarely holding territory. They were basically all on the offense. While the Imperial Navy, they were dispersed through the whole galaxy, in a vain effort to engage us, as Mon Mothma says in Return of the Jedi. Doing everything from anti-piracy to patrols to long-range operations. And I feel like it's telling that, even though we don't have like official numbers, going back to the overall issues with the Star Wars universe and military sci-fi, but it's telling that the number of Imperial Star Destroyers present at the Battle of Endor, if you like count between shots and Return of the Jedi, is like 30 to 40. And I know canonically, like, at least a couple of them are Interdictor Star Destroyers that the Rebel fleet can't run away. And yet that was seen as like an extraordinarily large concentration of force, which goes to show, and that kind of works for me, because it's like, yeah, like, you've got 25,000 Star Destroyers, but the galaxies are big. Like, that's ultimately not that many of them.
Yeah.
So yeah, being able to pull together like 30 to 40 of them for a single engagement is probably a big deal. And it's interesting that in some of the wider lore, like, Admiral Akbar actually, when he takes over the fleet again in Legends, he reorganizes the Rebel Alliance along more traditional lines, so like capital ships. And apparently the influence of Starfighter Command diminishes under Akbar's tenure, which I find a little dubious. He wins the war though, so I don't.
I mean, when it comes down to it, eventually, you pick and choose your battles, like you were saying, those hit and run tactics with X-wings coming in, blowing something up, getting out. Those work, but if you want to make a difference, eventually you need to do a pitch battle, or you need to just to cut up the head of the snake, so to say, and go for the Emperor, or go for those big engagements where you categorically knock out the Empire once or twice, and then as they're starting to scramble forces in order to defeat you, they're pulling forces from elsewhere. They're no longer policing certain sectors. They're losing control of supply lines and so on and so forth. So I think you can make an argument there for the Akbar doctrine, so to say. But you really have to get the timing right on that, and that is fundamentally what I guess we can argue that happens. But talking about then sort of the X-wings that come in from hyperspace and that destroy something, that just makes it all the more puzzling. To go back to my previous point that I've been hammering on about, why are there no more point defenses built everywhere? Cheap point defenses, economies of scale, just build them up, have them autonomously target anything that doesn't have an Imperial IFF signal, right? And even if you fake that, like, have some visual inspection or something with optical sensors, but whatever beyond that. But they also then start building fighters that can actually counter the X-wing and the Y-wing threat, right? With I think it's the Grand Admiral Thrawn actually who says that, at least in canon, we need something like it becomes a TIE Defender project that is capable then of operating independently from carriers. That gives the Empire this flexibility and agility to respond to the Rebel Alliance. However, what we never really see, and I guess this is a main issue with being able to pinpoint where exactly the rebels are, that the Empire switches tactics with small fleets and goes for hit and run tactics themselves, right? Because you could seriously interfere with the Rebel Alliance as well if you start acting rather than reacting to their incursions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. And I always thought it was clever in canon that they would tie Grand Admiral Thrawn, who's supposed to be this great strategic mind,
Yeah,
with thinking outside the box a little bit and going like, hey, instead of just more capital ships, building another Star Dreadnought or 5, we invest in this TIE Defender project that has hyperdrive and shielding, and it's just more capable overall. And then ultimately, of course, he loses the political and budgetary wars to craven sycophants like Krennic and and Tarkin with his own doctrine and his
illusion of
legacy that he
grandeur.
wants to
Yeah.
protect. And Thrawn, as any Star Wars fan will know, is his kind of greatest weakness is he lacks like kind of emotional intelligence. Like he's
Yeah.
not the best at grasping like political crap. He wants to analyze strategic stuff.
Yeah.
And I guess like it's worth discussing as well another partial answer, at least, that the Empire has to those rebel tactics, and that is interdictor technology, interdiction, which in Star Wars context it's a class of warship, or sometimes they also use like mines and stuff. But really what they do is they prevent any ship in a given radius from entering or remaining in hyperspace. So of course that's a huge threat to the rebels, because you need to hit and run, and how you hit and run in Star Wars is you jump back into hyperspace. But if you can't jump back in hyperspace, you're stuck there to fight.
Yeah.
And it seems like the main issue that the Empire had is that the Imperial Navy never seemed to have enough of these ships on hand. I mean, most famously, the absence of this class of ship in Death Squadron, which is the squadron that Vader is running in Empire Strikes Back, specifically to hunt down the Rebel Alliance, doesn't have interdictors in it, which is why they were able to jump away from Hoth.
I know what you're going to say now, and it's going to upset all the fans.
Oh, here we go. So there's no coherent lore explanation for this.
Yes.
So my headcanon is that the Imperial Navy hates Vader and didn't want to give him the best toys because Death Squadron was seen as his personal fleet. And it's because Vader, and I'm just going to say it, was a terrible commander of men. And
I'm out.
Bordered,
the comment section is yours.
Bordered on incompetent in his wielding of sizable military forces because he was a political appointee. Now, I know there's a lot of lore out there that's allowed the out-of-universe popularity of Vader to bleed into the universe, and he's often depicted as Space Jesus, who's the best at everything.
Yeah.
But honestly, if you pay attention in the original trilogy, he's really not that at all. Like, in A New Hope, he's not even the main antagonist, I would argue. That's Tarkin. He's the muscle bad guy in A New Hope. And then in Empire Strikes Back, he's definitely the main antagonist. And then they decide to just give him an arc in Return of the Jedi. But like his importance like increases over those movies. And then it's like elevated to the worst. Some of the worst stuff in the prequels is turning Anakin into Space Jesus. And it's like even other depictions that are trying to make him out like he's awesome. Like his main skill largely boils down to threatening and killing people. I'm not going to deny that he's extremely good at killing people.
Oh, yeah. Very efficient. He just flicks a finger and somebody chokes.
Like, anytime you see him wielding sizable military forces, he's not particularly good at it. And now I know some people that are more Star Wars fans are going to be like, well, but Anakin during the Clone Wars. It's like, Anakin and Vader, they're the same person, but they're also not.
Yeah.
Because he's a space wizard. And once he's fallen to the dark side, all of like Anakin's worst qualities are like dialed up to 12 out of 10. And then his better qualities are removed entirely, or they're very toned down. So what you're left with is somebody who is very emotional, and he acts very brashly, like way more than Anakin ever did. And he's because he's a Sith Lord, his power comes from feeding into his emotions. He's using that, and it means that he's not the best strategic mind or operational leader. And when your solution to like, oh, a subordinate of mine makes a mistake that ultimately isn't even really their fault, is to summarily execute them, that's a problem, because you're going to create a very toxic leadership culture very
Well,
quickly.
it's like you're taking away the ability of people to learn. Like what the Empire needed was people who are experienced with the rebel threat, and somebody who fails in an arguably and like critical moment. Yeah, sure, you can make an argument of that person maybe has to go, but people that make small mistakes, uh, like they have been honed and trained, and sometimes gotten to their position with nepotism, of course, but they have been honed and trained and like to act as the Empire. And a lot of these commanders don't necessarily have figured out yet how to fight the rebels. And if you're snuffing them out every single time they make a small mistake, which they will do because they haven't been trained for this, you're never going to have any sort of learning qualities or any sort of even tactical learnings that become institutional knowledge within the very squadron that you're commanding, that is meant to tackle the rebel alliance. And I mean, the point you were making of
That
him
you're
being
ramming into asteroids.
yes, exactly, or rebel ships, which they do in Rogue One, but that is like Vader unleashed and just going for it, and it pays off in a way, right? Where he just comes in guns blazing and just crashes into a couple of rebel ships. But Anakin to Vader really is sort of the scalpel of a commander who knows how to employ himself, sometimes with Ahsoka, his Padawan, or with Obi-Wan, in these small teams that, as the wider battle is going on, they're going for the command structure of the CIS or something like that, or they extract certain people. That was a very clever way of using his skill and his tactical abilities. But he becomes a bludgeon in and almost a comical sort of bad man. And I think the lore and the way that he was unveiled to the Empire, because he was a secret for some time as the Empire was forming, hunting down Jedi's, and eventually he gets unveiled to the officer corps, the high command of the Empire, as Palpatine's right hand man who can do anything he wants, and they're like, "Who's this guy?" With I think lore wise, we only know that sort of Tarkin starts to figure it out who he is,
Yeah.
but that's basically it. And he's. I wish I could say something else, and the comment section will not find an ally in me. But I also don't think he's a very good commander in the lore, the way he has been really set up.
Yeah, and I mean, it's I mean, even like in A New Hope, you can see like that's the Imperial Joint Chiefs that are meeting on the Death Star. It's
Yeah.
like a lot of them don't respect Vader clearly, and Tarkin basically keeps him on a leash.
Yeah.
Like Tarkin's like, okay, cut it out, Vader. Like, what are you doing? So, but it is interesting, and I guess to get back to like the interdiction stuff before
Yes, of course.
when before everyone clicked off the video because I said Vader's incompetent. The times where we do see interdiction work, and of course Grand Admiral Thrawn uses it perhaps most effectively generally, at the Battle of Adelon in the Rebels cartoon, which I know some people eye roll at because it's animation, but I mean, that's a pretty good battle. And it's like the Rebels do try to do the Rebel thing. Their Empire shows up with a big fleet. Okay, well, we're not going to fight it. Bye. And then they can't leave because he's got interdictors, and they have significant problems. Now, eventually they overcome it through different things. I'm not going to get down into a whole breakdown of it, but initially, like the Empire forces the rebels to ground. They have no answer to just fighting. I think he had about 6 Star Destroyers or something like that. It's like they have nothing that can touch that, and they try to tackle it head on briefly, and they just get slapped down like nothing. And then, of course, there are a couple interdictors at Endor as well. So Endor originally, of course, was supposed to be another opportunistic attack, just on a larger scale. And then it turns out, oh no, there's a sizable Imperial fleet there, and we can't run because they got a couple interdictor Star Destroyers. And that one is very interesting because that is the exact type of engagement that the Imperial Navy has built itself to fight.
Yeah.
And they're there in significant force, and they straight up lose it. which is very interesting. And again, there's not a whole lot of tactical detail on Endor, unfortunately. So my headcanon is kind of like, the death of the Emperor and then the destruction of the second Death Star, Executor going down with your commanding officer. As people know, I love Admiral Piet. And his whole staff, like I imagine their morale at that point was like, you know what? I'm gonna jump out of here and I'm gonna go back to my sector and become a king.
Well, that's
Which is what a
what's
lot of
set
them
up in
do.
like Star Wars Battlefront, right? In the newest one, where it's in the game, it says like "Piet, you fool," and
You
and
fool.
and like all
I will
these
accept no
ISD.
Piet hate.
But I
Vader
mean,
hate, yes.
it
Piet,
makes
no.
sense in a way because there are probably a lot of people commanding ISDs who are like, we okay, so the biggest thing we had is has been destroyed. Our command structure is eliminated. Who's in charge now? That's an answer that isn't, there's no command structure once the executor that goes down.
Yeah, so
Yeah,
Executor goes down, and then in Legends, it's Paleon that calls the
yeah.
retreat, I think, from his ISD, and then in canon, I think it's Sloane. Don't quote me on that, but
Well, yeah.
yeah.
Somebody will surely correct us if that is wrong, and that's fine. The But like a lot of them disintegrate then in warlords as well, so you can like make an argument that like maybe it's one or two of them saw their chance as well, and then just like fled out and were like, oh, I'm gonna carve out my own little empire now. But that's going too far into a direction that we don't necessarily have to explore now. Um, but yeah, it's bizarre how the or but actually with the interdiction point is you that is actually one more thing where we see learnings from the empire, because initially they have used tractor beams to try to pin
Mhm.
down rebels or like ships that try to leave quickly, and the rebels sufficiently counter that by using small ships and like being at ranges, having very quick ships that can get out to the tractor beam range before the ship even is able to grab onto to the rebel ship and these little corvettes that they're using. And the interdictor has way more range and just locks down an area. And again, that shows there is both in the canon, the way the universe has been set up, there is sort of a learning point that we can track, which brings me back to point defense. Why is there no point defense? But I will leave that point now. Um, I think we have been going on for a fair bit here, and obviously, if you have any comments on this discussion, do put them down below. Put your own explanations as well, and what you thought about this. But concluding thoughts here, Justin, please.
Yeah, so I guess the Imperial Navy seemed relatively slow to adapt, though again, in fairness, the full scale fighting the Galactic Civil War from Scarif to Endor in canon ran only about 4 years.
Mm-hmm.
Now, of course, in World War II, you could see a lot of change in 4 years.
Yeah.
But adding that galactic scale on top of it, like with the incomprehensible size of just the Imperial Navy, never minding all the bureaucracy, the procurement stuff. We need a whole series on Imperial procurement.
Oh yeah, shall
But
we do that?
and
Only
like
if you
I
do
can't
your
even
18
imagine.
hours talk about military intelligence about the Imperial Japanese Navy and Army. Only then. Once we do that, we move on to the next thing.
Then we'll do 65 hours on procurement for a galactic empire that doesn't exist.
Well, shall we write a
Um,
PhD on that?
but yeah, it's a huge thing.
Yeah.
So of course it's going to be a really, really hard to change direction quickly.
Mm.
And so I can buy that they're slow to adapt. And also, like, we have to remember that it's a rigid authoritarian system.
Oh yeah.
The Galactic Empire is not a hyper efficient machine. That can be efficient in some ways, but like any authoritarian system, that it's got lots of problems too. Um, like for example, really like the whole debate around the Death Star and the Tarkin Doctrine versus more flexible, more maybe more militarily sound strategies. It's like, of course, kind of the Death Star wins out because not only is the Galactic Empire it's an autocracy, but it's an autocracy run by a person who is literally an evil space wizard whose sole motivation is to be more powerful so that he can be more evil. So there'd be a great personal appeal to having something like the Death Star that centralizes a huge amount of the Imperial military's strength, so that he can personally control it. He can be like, go here with the Death Star, go there with the Death Star.
I wonder, like, just to briefly interrupt, because as you were saying that, point came to me. Did the Empire ever calculate the cost effectiveness of the Death Star versus, let's say, 5,000 ISDs?
Yeah, like, cause I don't know if they ever did number. I think Cassio Tag, that was kind of his whole thing. He's like, how many Star Dreadnoughts could we have built with the Death Star? And
He's
I
my
did read the
favorite
book.
admiral, just saying.
He's a general, okay, Imperial Army, chief of the Imperial Army. Check your
He's in
facts.
space. I'll call him
Unsubscribe.
Admiral. I will call him Admiral. He is in space and he manages the fleet post Yavin. He is an admiral he's the greatest of admirals of all times in my mind. And if you see
Yeah, 'cause
he's
body
an army
blows
general
up.
as well, that just shows how competent he is. He can do two things at once.
And yeah, like it's just, I buy it that political control first type of mentality overtakes the, like armchair admirals sitting there going, well, like this would be a better way to do it.
Yeah.
Because that's not necessarily how that system, and certainly not this system, is going to work. It's about what Palpy wants at the end of the day. Papa Palpy.
Do you think that they ever had a nickname, like amongst the Joint Chiefs for Emperor Palpatine, or is the ISB going to get on to that? It's like,
yeah. Oh man.
It's like, oh, we've got another memo from Palpy. What's he saying this time? No, yeah. So I mean, to basically sum up, I think we both consider that there are a lot of good things in lore where you can sort of track rational choices amongst it. The rule of cool sometimes gets in the way of things, but overall, you love this universe. I love this universe, and the ship design is awesome, and you can make a lot of sort of historical parallels between that universe and ours, and really with an open mind sort of think a little bit about, what would it be like to control an empire that is starfaring, that has so many planets under its control, and how would that look like as a republic where there's a certain element of democracy with a central governing senate, and how would that look like with an empire that does exactly what we see in the Star Wars movies. So yeah, I would call it here unless you have any final thoughts.
Not particularly. Everyone should watch Andor. It's the best Star Wars ever made.
Yes. Until this moment in time, because we never know what happens in a couple of years.
Maybe season 2 drops off a cliff. We'll see.
Yeah, no, I doubt it. It's got a really cool. For the first 3 episodes we watched already, this is coming out May the 1st, so I think it's up to episode 6 at that point.
Something like that.
Yeah, so May the 4th. So yeah, if you're watching Andor, let us know what you think about that as well. And as always, hope everyone has a great day and see you in a galaxy far, far away. May the 4th be with you.